this is on the Daily Mail right now, for example, Putin's hospital atrocity. I mean, you are seeing the awfulness of war, and people are becoming more emotionally involved in the desire to do something in Ukraine. What does this mean if Putin starts to lose? Here is a nuclear weapons expert, Joe Cirincione, saying if Putin starts losing, the risk grows.
That's the danger. Ironically, if he is losing the war, the nuclear risks grow. The stakes for him become very high, and he may feel like a gambler at the table who's losing his hand. He's just going to bet the house. And Russian doctrine does allow for something called escalate to de-escalate, to use a nuclear weapon first to try to back off the West if they're losing.
He's right about that. That is Russian military doctrine. That they will use a nuke as essentially a back off maneuver if they think they're about to lose dramatically. Clay, we've gone quite a ways from just a couple of weeks ago, where the country seemed very much in favor of non-intervention, and now over 70% say they want a no-fly zone.
Well, this is, I think, utterly the danger, and the analogy we've used, and I think it's a good one on this show, is the guy who loses the fist fight. And maybe Putin is losing the fist fight right now and isn't happy with the result and the embarrassment that comes with that loss, and decides to bring a knife or a gun, or brings in a bunch more guys to try to exact revenge over what has happened. I also think we should mention, Buck, the situation in Poland. We talked about that live on the show yesterday, and I think diagnosed what ultimately the State Department ended up coming to that same conclusion, which was, and to reiterate for people out there who may have missed this, the idea was Poland was going to give airplanes, jets, fighter jets, to Ukraine, but they were going to do it by using a base in Germany to make the transfer. And initially we said, look, if they try to do it in Poland, then the Russians may well attack those jets before they get airborne. And so Poland said, hey, we'll put those jets in Germany. But what you then create is the possibility of Vladimir Putin attacking Germany to try to keep those jets from going into Ukraine and making it to Ukraine airspace. And so what you're pointing to, Buck, 70% of people may favor a no-fly zone, but they're probably thinking about the no-fly zone in the context of what happened in Iraq, where we had total air superiority and we weren't in danger of creating World War III. I thought Marco Rubio said it well when he said, look, a no-fly zone basically creates the entire situation for World War III to exist. And if that were to end up happening, what we're doing is sort of a slow walk up to potentially an escalating situation where the United States gets officially drawn in. And that's the debate we were having yesterday, Buck. At what point does aid become not aid anymore, but an actual tacit action to put you in as a combatant? To me, fighter planes feels like it's pretty close.
I think it was last week, Clay, when I said here, I understand we're rooting for Ukraine because they're the underdogs. They've been invaded. And there's all these reports about how strong the resistance has been. The Russian war machine is vicious, it is fierce, and it is gaining ground. They are currently, if you look at it on a map, carving up areas of Ukraine and establishing total control on the ground. Now, it's not a majority of Ukraine, but there's a whole region in the north, a region in the east, and a region in the south where they're effectively creating a de facto annexation for the Russian Federation. That's happening right now. They're also increasing the shelling. They're increasing the destructiveness that they're willing to engage in at this phase. And when we're talking about a no-fly zone, to the point you just made a second ago, it is, when you put American planes in the sky and you say, we will shoot down Russian planes, now it just turns into who's going to fire first. Because there's no way Russian planes and American planes are in a no-fly zone and they're just flying past each other and nothing happens, right? We know that. So here's a former ambassador who's actually on MSNBC saying, you shouldn't call it just a no-fly zone. Here's what you should call it.
I think a no-fly zone is the wrong move. Let's just get rid of this euphemism, no-fly zone. Let's call it for what it is war. If we try to implement a no-fly zone, that means that an American pilot has to shoot down a Russian pilot. And if we do that, that's a declaration of war. And Vladimir Putin has been very clear that that's the way he sees it. And if we're prepared to do that, if the American people want to go to war with Russia, I think it would be a mistake. But if we're prepared to do it, then we should have a vote in the U.S. Congress, because the Congress is supposed to declare war. That's what we need to do first. We should stop calling it a no-fly zone, and we should start calling it declaration against Russia to go to war.
That was former U.S. Ambassador to Russia for a long time, McFaul, who I'll say is a leftist and something of a loon on things like Trump issues. But on this point, on this issue, Clay, I think what he's saying is true. I think what he's saying is right.
And also, Buck, it doesn't even require a conscious decision and intent to shoot down a plane. You know this as well as anybody out there listening to would also. The amount of potential errors that could come into play when you've got all of these jets flying around over Ukraine, even if there is an attempt to avoid conflict, it virtually is impossible to have that conflict avoidance occur. So, yeah, I think that's really where the rubber meets the road. We have to decide what is our limit in terms of engagement as it pertains to Russia and Ukraine. And so far, to me, and I don't know if you agree with this, Buck, but giving jets to Ukrainians and allowing them to take off and pilot those jets feels awfully close to me. I mean, and I don't know if you agree with me, but I'm thinking about it almost in, try to think about it from a Russian Vladimir Putin perspective. It's one thing if you're giving guns. It's another thing if you're giving even the anti-tank apparatus and everything else. Theoretically, Ukraine could find ways to buy that on the black market. You can't buy a jet on the black market, right? Like, you can't just randomly end up with one of these high-powered jets. So there is, to me, a standard where giving armaments goes beyond just, hey, here's some guns, here's some anti-tank missiles, here's some javelin materials. And, oh, by the way, here's 20 fighter jets. The fighter jets feels to me, Buck, like a pretty substantial acceleration if I'm looking at this from a Russia perspective.
Well, if they're going to be if they are taking off from bases outside Ukraine,
yes, which they have to be,
which they initially would be. I mean, I don't think they're going to draw them. They're not going to put them on trucks and take them across the border by land. So they're going to fly them in. But if they're flying strikes from outside of Ukrainian territory, the Russians are going to see that as, I mean, that is an act of war. I mean, we just need to start using these terms. That's an act of war. If you're allowing someone else to fly planes off to do strikes against you, you're going to look at that as they're a belligerent now. They're in the conflict.
Even to your point, you have to start that way, right? Because they're not going to put these things on trains or on big trucks and try to somehow cross the border with the plane on the ground. Like, you have to have them take off with Ukrainian pilots from another country to fly in. That feels to me like, if I'm Russia, a declaration of war in some ways. It's different than bringing guns or bringing these other materials across the border. To me, do you feel the same way that feels like a fairly substantial acceleration?
It's an escalation for sure, which is why I think the U.S. response to it has been, whoa, hold on a second. We didn't coordinate on this yet.
Yeah.
So there's clearly something different. Plus, we were already selling armaments. I mean, the Chinese, yes. I mean, there are people that have been selling armaments to Russia. We're not about to say we're at war with them, right? There's something more specific and something next to the battlefield, so to speak, about allowing the MiGs to be transferred to Ukraine that clearly is raising concerns, raising tensions. And I'm amazed, Clay, at people say, and I've seen this now, Putin's not going to fire nukes if we start shooting his planes out of the sky.
Yeah, it's
really?
a big bold gamble to just be saying that.
That's think about what we're talking. We're not saying the ruble might tank 15% if we start shooting planes out of the sky. It's he won't fire nuclear weapons, folks. So this is what we're having this discussion right now. We've just come out of a 2-year pandemic. And we're closer, in America at least, to the prospect of a nuclear exchange than what? Any time since the Cuban Missile Crisis, probably? I mean, let's be realistic. When was the last time we were really sitting around saying, this feels like it could go wrong and there could be nukes at any moment? It's been decades at a minimum.
Certainly. 35 years at least back to the 80s.
Look at how quickly we've moved along. I mean, I'm kind of stunned, Clay, at the polling. And people can say, well, Buck, maybe you shouldn't believe the polling, but I see a lot of people on the right. No, we need to do this no-fly zone for Ukraine. Really? All of a sudden, a no-fly zone. We're 2 weeks into this. And by the way, what have I been saying? It's going to get ugly. Forget about the ghost of Kyiv and the beauty queen with her airsoft rifle and all this initial propaganda about the glorious resistance. This is going to turn into hell. It's going to look awful. We're going to see some of it. It's going to be playing on the emotions of everyone who's not in the conflict. And you have to think about this stuff rationally and in a calculated fashion. Because miscalculation here, Clay, that's the kind of stuff that keeps people up. I don't know what else to say. I mean, how much higher can the stakes possibly be than what we're talking about right now with these decisions about U.S. involvement in Ukraine, which I'm sitting here saying, no.
Here's a question that I have for you, Buck, and you may know the answer, and I don't know, and I haven't even seen it covered very much. What kind of protection, missile shield, do we have in the event that Putin decided to launch a nuke? Let's talk, I mean, to what extent do we have the knowledge technologically to be able to try to keep one of these things from landing? That used to be talked about a lot in the 1980s and the early 90s when the Cold War was still kind of in conscious thought. I don't remember having that conversation in 30 years.
Pose it to you this way, and then we'll bring in somebody who understands the combat on the ground very well, you know, how this stuff goes. Jack Carr, former Navy SEAL, who's a sniper, saw combat overseas. He'll be joining, best-selling author, too. You guys, I'm sure, have read his books. He'll be joining us in just a few minutes. Clay, I would just say this. The government that just made us mask up for 2 years unnecessarily is not a government that I sleep well at night hoping would be able to shoot a nuclear weapon out of the sky in time. I'm going to tell you that right now. I don't know. You know, I've been out of the system. I've been out of the national security side for a while, so I don't even know what the current capabilities are. And fortunately, because it's I'm sure very, very sensitive and secret, but I don't sleep well at night thinking about that.
Let's pretend that Vladimir Putin is backed up against the wall and he makes the decision to fire a nuclear weapon. Let's presume that he decides to do that. Obviously, an awful, horrible situation. Where does he fire it? And what are the chances that we could, meaning the countries that potentially would be targeted, shoot down that nuclear missile without it landing? And what does that even look like? I mean, is that a cataclysmic explosion when you shoot down a nuclear warhead in the air? Like, what is it? What would where do you think he would aim? And what do you think the chances are that we could shoot it down?
Look, there's a whole set, and this is a little bit, Clay, like in the sports world, there are people who know baseball really well and people who know football really well. And I'll just tell everybody, missiles is
not your level of
I have
expertise.
a baseline level of knowledge about this from time in government and academically. So this is not, and I've got some friends who could come on who could speak to this with greater specificity than I can. So I always want to tell this audience what I know and what I don't know.
Yeah.
In terms of where he would fire, I think the most likely scenario, and this is from conversations I've had with missile people.
Yes,
that's how the missile.
By the way, a missile guy or girl, whoever that is, would actually be kind of a fascinating conversation. Because are you with me that there's just not that much discussion about this in an intelligent fashion?
I think people are waving off the possibility of a low yield nuclear weapon being used. Remember, there's different grades and levels of nukes, but a low yield nuclear weapon being used by Putin as essentially all right, you know I've got ICBMs, you know I've got a lot more. That was a taste of what's coming. Do you want more? So I think the light you're asking me, if Putin does go with that madman move of firing off a nuke, I think it's a low-yield tactical, they call it tactical, nuclear weapon that goes off somewhere in theater. And I think if there's airfields involved, for example, in a no-fly zone, I mean, that would probably be the first place you go. In terms of whether they could shoot it down, I honestly, I don't know.
I'd love to know, Buck, even a simple question like, how much notice do you have? I mean, you were saying you don't have a lot of faith in the United States. I get that.
Yeah, that's just a general thing, since they make me mask up on airplanes still like morons.
No doubt. But when it goes up, when the missile is fired, how much time knowledge do we have? There's some really interesting questions that aren't being talked about very much.